Chapter 9 Mirocaw. Zoe awoke, staring into the empty sockets of a skull. Not human, it was a misshapen thing, one eye hole appreciably larger than the other, and a third gaping just above it, its gap-toothed grin seeming to welcome her into some murderous new realm where proportions were a joke and nothing made sense. There was a dusky blue sapphire, probably fake, embedded in the thing's one remaining incisor. The skull's current owner had strung several lengths of thick cable through its facial sinuses, so that it dangled like a grotesque bead on a string, and when Zoe sat up and tried to move away from it, the fullness of the chamber where she'd awakened came into view. She was inside a kind of trophy room. The cable ran from one side of the room to the other. Rows of similar skulls hung on either end, dozens of them, grouped together in clusters while others were set apart in twos and threes to create a kind of ghastly abacus. Beneath it, an irregular array of vats and stained crucibles bubbled steadily over heating elements. In them, Zoe saw more bones and shanks of raw knobbed limbs protruding upward, some sheathed in yellow fat and sinew while others seemed to have boiled down to the marrow. Moss and mildew covered the ceilings, years of lichen and mold, colonies of life competing for airborne fat molecules coming off the pots. The smell of scalded viscera hung permanently in the air. Swallowing, trying not to gag, Zoe squirmed again and felt something slick and oily brush against the back of her arms. Turning around, she saw the entire wall behind her was lined with skins and hides, each one crawling with layers of tiny blind beetles industriously gnawing away. She watched, helpless, as they burrowed in and out of the hanging flank, hauling off chunks of grayish flesh.
"Vasky scarabs,"
a voice behind her said. Zoe snapped back around and saw the whippet standing in the doorway. His gaze was intense, corrosive, as if he could already see through her skin to the skeleton she would inevitably leave behind. Bones he might boil out of her if she weren't worth waiting for the natural decay process to do it first. Zoe moved her head slightly and winced at the pain in the base of her neck. She remembered those last few moments at the Marfa facility. The butt end of the whippet's spear, a glassy rocket of agony, the blurry slither of the corridor as it warped past the lens of her ever-dimming consciousness, and just before she'd blacked out, the hatchway. Zoe looked past the whippet, regarding her surroundings through this new, unwelcome perspective. The whine of turbines under the floorboards, the persistent shiver of the bulkhead, though the room was without any sort of viewport, offering no sight of their greater surroundings. She realized they had to be in flight. "Is this your ship?" The whippet nodded once.
"The Mirocaw."
"Where are we going?" This time, he didn't answer, lumbering instead over to the nearest of the pots. She watched as he lifted the lid and dipped in with an oxidized pair of tongs, hoisting a grubby clump of something that she realized was a type of shank. Bits of gristle and musculature, part of a leg, dangled from its lower edges. With an unimpressed grunt, the whippet dropped the part back into the pot and slapped the lid back down, then turned to walk out again. "Wait!" she said hoarsely. The bounty hunter didn't stop. The hatch slid shut. A moment after he left, Zoe found the orchid. It was still inside the half-crushed specimen flask, strapped almost haphazardly between a cargo drop panel and a swing bin above the vats of limbs and skulls. Her captor had used the same greasy cable he'd strung through the skulls to tie the containment vessel into place. From where she stood below it, she saw that the orchid had flourished, even while she'd lain there unconscious. Simple, physical proximity seemed enough to keep it alive, despite the fact that for a good bit of time, she'd been out cold. Zoe looked at it. "Hello?" Nothing. "It's me. Can you hear me?" The initial process of communication was never easy. At first it had felt almost unnatural. Yet with practice, through countless mornings spent sitting alone with the orchid, she'd soon reached a level of mastery that eased the transitory awkwardness into a smoother and more organic leap. "Are you there?" Within its glass vessel, the plant finally twitched, brightening slightly in recognition of her presence. Zoe watched its dust-colored stem inclining towards her like a beckoning finger. At the same time, she felt its life essence stirring within her, filling an almost physical void directly behind her breastbone and between her lungs, a place she thought almost colloquially as her soul. At the same time, she heard the first coarse whispers of its voice, gender-neutral, incoherent at first, and then becoming clearer, like a foreigner adapting to the nuances of an entirely new language.
Zoe, what happened? Are we well?
Zoe gave a rueful smile, felt the lump on the back of her head. I wouldn't exactly say that. The orchid was silent a moment. Then,
I sense that things have changed.
You can say that again, she murmured aloud.
Repeat.
We've been abducted, Zoe told it. Taken. Another silence. Then,
Yes, that is true. By this creature, Tulk.
Her eyes darted back up to it. That's his name?
The Whipped? Yes. He's
hunting for the correct phrase.
What is it, this word? One who takes people for money.
A bounty hunter, Zoe said, and felt the orchid nodding in agreement.
Yes, solitary, a bloodthirsty species, and aggressive.
Zoe waited, processing the comment. The orchid had a gift for understatement, and she couldn't help but wonder about the criteria for this assessment. And a flower collector to boot, she told it. If the orchid had an opinion on this, it didn't voice it. What does he want? She asked. The orchid stayed silent. Staring at it, Zoe began to realize how her fully awakened presence had already affected the trophy room's biosphere. The naturally occurring moss on the ship's ceiling had started spreading at a noticeably accelerated pace, sprawling to swallow up the exposed bolts and seams in the interior walls. There was some kind of switchplate just above her head, with a sign written in another language. The Whipped's mother tongue, she assumed, but it was already so moss-covered that she couldn't make out the letters. Scraps of green rot within the skulls had begun extending their first initial tendrils up as well, reaching outward through eye sockets and trepanned holes. Simply by being here, she jump-started the growth of the Mirocaw's incidental flora. Do you at least know where he's taking us? Again, no immediate response from the orchid. Zoe wondered if she'd reached the outer limits of the flower's knowledge. Then she felt the spacecraft jerk hard to one side, the nearly subsonic whine of the turbine pitch-shifting into afterburner mode, and realized she was about to get the answer for herself. What's going on? Are we crashing? She asked.
Going down,
the orchid said. Where? Silence again. Then,
the worst place in the galaxy.